you. Good afternoon, bonjour. My name is Nandini Ramanujam, and I am the Interim Director of Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, and its Program Director. I'm also a professor at the Faculty of Law. On behalf of the Center, it is my great pleasure to host you for what is expected to be a rich and insightful conversation involving Dr. Yolanda Munoz and Professor Sébastien Jodoin. This conversation is being recorded under the auspices of Dialogues in Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. It's a series which aims to capture the rich intellectual diversity of our members and collaborators. Today's recording will be 10th dialogue in this series, and the other 9 are available on Center's website and its YouTube channel. I'll start with brief introduction of 2 dear colleagues, and I don't think I will go through their very impressive bios, but just brief introduction. Dr. Muñoz is a senior research associate with Canada Research Chair in Human Rights and Environment, working on issues intersecting disability and environment justice. She has more than 25 years of experience as an advocate for people with disabilities in Mexico, Canada, and at the international level. She is also a co-investigator with the recently launched Disability Inclusive Climate Research Action Program, about which we learn a bit more later. Our speakers are both part of this initiative, and they will walk us through what it is about. Professor Sébastien Jodoin is a professor at the Faculty of Law and the director of the recently launched Disability Inclusive Climate Action Research Program. The program has been co-founded by the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, and Professor Jodoin's Canada Research Chair on Human Rights and Environment. His work focuses on the relationship between human rights and efforts to address complex environmental problems. He is recognized for his cutting-edge scholarship on climate governance. So I'm going to start this conversation by asking a question to Yolanda. I came across one of her old bios, and where I learned that she holds a doctorate in cultural anthropology, and her work is focused on Ainu people in Japan. So I would like to ask you, Yolanda, as a woman from Mexico, your interest in East Asia, and particularly in Japan, how did it sort of come about? And your transition from that area, where you've dedicated significant amount of time and you have a rich body of scholarship, to disability and environment. So over to you, Yolanda.
Thank you very much, Nandini, for having me today and for asking me this question. Well, yeah, in fact, yes, not many people know that I have a PhD on East Asian and African studies. And well, I mean, I think that everything has been a part of the process of acquiring a disability when I was in my mid-20s. And so as part of my plan B in life, if you want, I decided to start a master, and then I followed to the PhD program on East Asian studies, and I decided to focus on the Ainu people of northern Japan because I found very interesting first to learn about multiculturalism in Japan, that in general the general public perceives as a monolithic culture, but in fact is quite varied. And and it was in line with my previous uh, research and my previous interests on racism in Mexico. So as I started, well, assimilating my new identity as a wheelchair user, and learning about racism in Japan, I also had the opportunity to make connections and to start learning of the then well, very young uh, discipline of disability studies. And I started making connections, say like racism, ableism, and as well discrimination on the basis of gender, because that was the other level of complexity that I incorporated in my work as while studying the Ainu people. I specialized on the literature of the Ainu women of Japan. And so I started making connections, and well, it was very enriching. I think that for all of the all of the research that I was doing to connect the dots on how you create systems of privilege and oppression on the basis of several circumstances, and who holds the power and how subordination is constructed. So yeah, and well, yes, when I decided to come to Canada, I had a lot of opportunities to expand more on disability studies and work more at the international level on advocacy. And this is why I have now today the opportunity to be with you. And thank you very much for this question.
Thank you. This really informs me and hopefully all of us about this rich intersectional work you do as an advocate, as a teacher at gender and feminist studies at McGill, and as a researcher with the Disability Inclusive Climate Program. So we will get to know a little bit more about other dimensions of your work. But I'll turn to Sébastien. And Sébastien, when and how you got interested in environmental issues, environmental justice, and sustainable development issues. And just a follow-up question so that you'll have time to integrate both elements. And what has motivated you to get involved with the field of disability and link it to your previous international level work on environmental justice?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Nandini. For as long as I remember, as I can remember, I've been committed to human rights and environmental issues. Studied those things in law school at McGill, and for a very long time, for several years, they were kind of separate tracks. So I would go. I worked at the International Criminal Tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. I worked for Amnesty International, and I would take some time off to go to the climate negotiations and follow those issues there. And then eventually realized that there were intersections here, and started working on that. So I have to say, everyone maybe has a theory of originality, what they, what is their recipe for doing things that are original. And some people will spend years working on a single topic and find every single nuance. And I think my strength has been connecting things. So I had these experiences where I remember working at Amnesty International, and they were looking for someone to go to the climate negotiations for their first delegation in 2009. And I was basically the only person in the group that had been there before. So I raised my hand and I said, I'll go. And so similar issues where I've been with human rights lawyers who didn't know much about climate change, right? So, and I guess the disability angle, despite being, a proper human rights lawyer working at the UN, working at Amnesty, I really did not know much about disability. Even the term ableism, I feel like I didn't really hear. And I think that's just part of, ableism, the sort of erasure of disability and identity and as a social movement. But just to mark now the 5th year, so 5 years ago, I was diagnosed with relapsing multiple sclerosis. And at the time, so I describe this experience as having a crash course in disability, because I sort of quickly, decided I was going to move. Even I remember in the emergency room, decided that I wanted to work on these issues. And my initial thought was that, of course, I had no idea, by the way, what that meant, but I thought that maybe it would be healthcare related. And then maybe 6 months later, living in Montreal in these hot and humid summers, I discovered I was quite sensitive to heat, which is a very common symptom in people with neurological conditions. And then I suddenly realized that this problem that I had been working on for almost, well, at that point, 10 years, was affecting climate change, was affecting me in a different way than others. And around the same time, I was working on this edited book with leading lawyers and scholars and activists working on human rights and climate change. It's the Routledge Handbook of Human Rights and Climate Governance. And we were working on this, and when it occurred to me that there was this disability climate angle, and I thought to myself, okay, in this book, all these people, we have a book on gender and climate, children and climate, indigenous peoples and climate, and no one was thinking about disability at all. So again, that's ableism for you. And that's how I decided that I would start working on this. And that's basically the origins of thinking about how to connect these dots.
Thank you. And this very nicely brings me to our newly launched Disability Inclusive Climate Action Research Program. It is conceived by Sébastien Jodoin, who is, we are privileged to have him as a member of the center. And he invited the center to partner with him in co-creating this timely and what I think is a cutting edge research action program, which connects scholarly research, university to advocates. And there is a bi-directional feedback loop. We learn a lot from advocates and activists in the field, and we hope that we will contribute to capacity building in this intersectional area. So I'd like to ask Sébastien, now I understand why you connected your environmental governance work to the work of disability, but what was the prompt for you to think about, we have to have a program like this, which connects the world of advocacy to the world of academy, let's just say. So,
well, I mean, basically, there's a lot of work to be done in relation to human rights and climate change more generally. But in relation to disability and climate change, when I started working on this about 2 years ago, there was really almost nothing. So we don't have, even today, we don't have a single empirical assessment of the capacity of people with disabilities to cope with climate impacts. We have those assessments for other groups. We could have more, but we don't. We don't have analysis of climate policies and how they affect people with disabilities. The climate movement has not done enough or even thought about trying to integrate or include people with disabilities in the climate movement. It's really just beginning. Disability groups themselves are starting to, they have lots of expertise in areas relevant to climate change, and especially in disaster risk reduction. But climate change has not been a key focus or area of engagement for the disability movement. So basically, there's just a huge gap in terms of knowledge and advocacy and capacity. And that's what the program aims to do, is to work with scholars, but also disabled activists, bring together climate activists as well to generate this knowledge, build that capacity, and advocate for, as the program indicates, disability inclusive climate action.
Thank you. Yolanda, what do you think? I mean, you are a co-investigator with the program, and among many other things, you are playing a central role in this newly established program. What, from your perspectives, are some of the opportunities we have for the program, and what are some of the challenges for us, given that we are located in a Canadian university and we do have limited resources. We'll always have limited resources. So what are some of the opportunities and challenges you see for DICAR?
Wow, there are so many opportunities because, as Sébastien mentioned, this is a very new field of study. So it is always exciting to be the pioneer in a field of studies, because you have a lot of freedom. And at the same time, it has happened parallel to a very specific movement for advocacy for inclusion also at the international level. And I think that the opportunity that we have is to make connections between the academic world and the advocates who are working at the international level. But the most important opportunity is to produce knowledge. Because from my experience working in the inclusion of disability on environmental justice activities prior to joining Sébastien, what we noticed in the ground, at the grassroots level, is that the organizations of people with disabilities did not know anything about environmental justice and climate change, because they have a different agenda. They are worried about poverty, about income generation, education. There are so many priorities in the agenda of disability rights that climate change and environmental justice didn't make it to the priority areas of the TPOs. So we had to. I mean, in my work for Global Green Grants Fund, this is the first conclusion that we reached, that we didn't know each other. So also we have the opportunity as academics to create, to produce knowledge that will inform the work of environmental justice defenders, environmental justice promoters, and climate change decision makers. So there's plenty of room for action, and there's work for everyone. And I think that we can act, I mean, our contribution as knowledge producer is extraordinary, but there's so much to do that I think that we have the opportunity to just contribute, and that is more than an extraordinary opportunity, in my opinion.
Thank you. And the hybridity both of you represent as academic and advocates, and you don't separate those two sides of your life and work is really exemplary for many of our students who are working with both of you as a part of this initiative. And with that, I wanted to ask Sébastien first, and perhaps then go to you, Yolanda. what is your aspiration? So in 5 years' time from now, what do you think DICARP would have achieved, which will make you happy, proud that we had set out a goal, and it's a long-term commitment, but just in 5 years, what do you hope that we should achieve together, which will make you proud?
So I guess what I would hope is that 2 years ago when I started working on this and I was meeting with people in the climate space or even human rights lawyers working on climate change, and I said I wanted to work on disability in climate change, and they looked at me puzzled and they said, well, what does that mean? So, I mean, we will have done our job in 5 years if I don't get those puzzled looks anymore, right? If it's not a complete afterthought. So that if we've built an evidence base and we've promoted, we're using the human rights model of disability in our work. And so if there's if on the climate side of things, if people at least understand that disability should be part of the agenda and have understand how the relevance of disability rights in various parts of the climate movement, whether it's climate policies at the domestic or multilateral level, whether it's looking at mitigation, so the role of people with disabilities in reducing carbon emissions, ensuring that those initiatives don't harm them, the importance of disability inclusive climate adaptation, and then also the climate movement itself. That like any other part of society, there's lots of ableism in the environmental movement, and there are things that people don't think about at all. And so, you know, if that could be something in the same way, and what I always say is that 20 years ago, when people started connecting Indigenous rights or gender to the climate agenda, people had no idea what that meant. Well, some people did, obviously, but many people didn't know, and the conversation was very advanced. So I'm hoping that we can be part of catalyzing this conversation. Then, of course, we have some much more specific things that we're trying to accomplish with others. But I think, you know, in 5 years, if that, you know, if it's part of the agenda, that would make me really happy, or satisfy me anyway.
Thank you. Yolanda, maybe you have your own a target, a dream that what we could achieve together.
Well, I think that I share most of Sebastian's dreams, and this is what we like. Why I like working with him and with all the team, you know? Because we have this shared ideal of building of building community, of building bridges, and yes, at this point, it is explaining them about ableism, which also has a very important value, because we are, I like where we are right now, but I hope, I mean, 5 years is probably a very short period of time. No, with, I mean, having fought the fights that I've been in, but it will be incredibly progressive if people working towards environmental justice do not have to question anymore why it is important to include people with disabilities, and why you cannot talk about social justice if you are excluding 15% of the population of the world. That will be my ideal, know that they don't feel intimidated anymore, but on the contrary, that they feel enriched by the presence of people with disabilities.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Yolanda, and I'll come back to you, and I think you'll have another opportunity to engage with this. I think you are saying 15% of the global population, which is on some spectrum of disability, or we may acquire a disability in our lifetime. So it's a significant percentage of people in our shared humanity. So it is no minor concern. So I'll come back to you on that one. But I go back to you, Sébastien, and some of it you have already spoken to. But I would like to know more precisely the potential for the human rights model for disability justice within the context of climate change. Seems like we talk a great deal about the human rights model, but what is its potential to, in reality, transform the paradigm?
So the first thing, I guess, if I organize it along the lines of different aspects of the climate agenda, the first thing is in terms of mitigation, that there's now a large body of international reports, decisions, domestic court decisions that recognize that states have obligations to reduce their carbon emissions rapidly as a result of the obligations they owe to protect their citizens. And we know that people with disabilities are disproportionately affected by climate change, whether it's gradual onset impacts, such as gradual increase in temperature or severe weather events. And so under the convention, we can say that states actually have an obligation to reduce their carbon emissions as a way of fulfilling their obligations to people with disabilities. So that's grounding the decision making of states in relation to how fast and even whether to reduce their carbon emissions in human rights principles is important. And then also we have cases, several in Canada and many around the world, where citizens are suing their governments because they're not doing enough to reduce their emissions to protect their citizens. So I think that's one point. I think a second point is when we adopt measures to reduce our emissions, a human rights framework tells you that you need to do so in a way that doesn't also infringe on the rights of different groups. So the straw ban example is really interesting to think about here, unfortunate. So for those who are less familiar with it, right? So suddenly there was a viral sort of movement towards banning plastic straws, which is a good thing for the planet, it's a good thing for the ocean. It's a good thing for combating climate change also. But there was no thought given to the fact that some people, because of impairments that they have, need to use plastic straws. And there was no thought to thinking about alternatives to plastic straws that, they had. I mean, they were saying paper, but they don't work. So anyway, that's the kind of thing that a disability rights approach would allow you to think about. And ideally, you don't want to just ensure that your measures to combat climate change are not violating the rights of persons with disabilities. You want to make sure that they actually are fulfilling those rights. So there's a really interesting example in the European Union where they have in their climate strategy at EU level a commitment with funding to retrofit all of their buildings to make them energy efficient. And as part of that, they also are supposed to make them accessible. So that's really interesting to think about those synergies. If we're going to promote mass transit as a way of reducing carbon emissions, let's make sure those systems are accessible. If we're going to promote teleworking, perhaps for some all the time, for some a few days a week to reduce travel as well, that's also something that we can think about. How do we do that with in a way that fulfills the rights of people with disabilities? Then on adaptation, well, here basically, as I mentioned before, people with disabilities are disproportionately affected by a variety of climate impacts. And so again, it's critical that our efforts to assess climate risks, to develop policies to reduce those risks, take into account the needs of people with disabilities. So I'll just give you one very specific concrete example. In 2018, there was a heat wave in Montreal that killed over 60 people. And a quarter of the people who died in this heat wave had schizophrenia. So that's 500 times a greater rate of mortality that you would expect based on their share of the population in Quebec. I can cite other types of events just in Canada, but of course all over the world, where you have these disproportionate rates of mortality. And there's usually, the reason is there's nothing planned for moving people who have certain ongoing medical needs, or who are wheelchair users. There's nothing planned to communicate with people who have social, psychosocial disabilities. And so disability has to be an integral part of the adaptation planning of countries. And we see that there's been efforts to integrate gender in adaptation planning around the world, but not in any way do we find an equivalent focus on disability. And that's a huge problem, and that's something that we need to change.
Thank you. Yolanda, I was going to ask you something which intersected with climate justice, but having heard Sébastien, his very comprehensive and sort of, very granular sort of answer, I would like you to tell us about the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, United Nations Convention. 2008 ushered in an era of thinking about disability very differently, the paradigm shift conversation, and nothing for us without us slogan, and it is about empowerment of people with disabilities. And it's been 12 years, and as you rightly reminded me, 5 years is not a long time, 12 years is not a long time either. But what do you think paradigm has really shifted? And if it has it shifted just in discourse, or it has actually started to show signs of shifting in real world for people with disabilities?
Well, that's a very interesting and wide question as well, because you have to consider the many levels that are related to the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. At the international level, of course, it has played a key role on a meaningful or at least concrete inclusion of disability in the Sustainable Development Goals 2015-2030, which is one of the main accomplishments that I can think of in relation to this specific topic. And it had never been possible without the convention. Also, at the same time, the convention has enlarged the dialogue on several topics, but the convention specifically includes in Article 11 disaster risk reduction. So the efforts that have been done thus far are related to disaster risk readiness and disaster risk reduction. So climate action is not really included in the convention. And everything is related to the erratic weather patterns that will cause hurricanes and heat waves and wildfires, and how are we going to protect people with disabilities and build back better according to the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction, which is also another outcome of the effectively using the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities as an advocacy tool at the international level. Now, in this sense, it has been quite effective. The problem is that the in-country level, because very few countries have really created a legislation that is completely in line with the content and principles of the CRPD. And well, it changes from country to country. And of course, there are a lot of inequalities as well, economic inequalities between countries. And well, everything around the world changes and you have to go case by case. So in the case of climate action, we need to go a little bit further from the initial content of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and add to disaster risk reduction climate action. And in that sense, we have the opportunity as scholars to participate in this process of widening the scope of disaster risk reduction to climate action, because it's not in the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. However, there are many things that are related, particularly the right to access to clean water, the right to access to a decent job, and there are many things that are related, but I think that the most important one is the obligation to level the playground for everybody. That is because the effects of climate action, of climate change are mostly related to social inequalities too. And people with disabilities, as we know, are among the poorest of the poor. And I think that the most problematic thing is that nobody cares. And this is where we have the responsibility to say, of course, you have to care about it. And build knowledge on the Convention on Rights of People with Disabilities and how we can use it to enrich the dialogue on environmental justice, climate action, and disability rights. And
thank you. And it nicely brings me to my last set of questions, which is about you as educators, people who are in the academy, working with younger generation, raising consciousness of colleagues, university community, and students on issues of disability and climate justice. So I'm going to ask, start with Sébastien. So what principles, or do you have a philosophy which guides you as a professor and as a scholar? And while you talk to us about that, what would you consider some key milestones in your academic and scholarly career thus far? There's a long way to go.
That's a lot to talk about. I first of all, I don't think of myself as that old, but but I know that I guess I am vis-a-vis the students, but not in the faculty anyway. I think to me, I sometimes feel a little bit. I had this experience of writing my master's thesis many years ago, in 2006. It was and I finished it while I was working at the UN in the International Criminal Tribunal in Rwanda, and I was living in Tanzania. And I wrote this paper, which was about the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas and taking his ideas to look at non-state actors in international law. And I thought it was it's still my most cited paper. I published it. I was very proud of it, but I must say I found it was very, it was very theoretical. It was very critical theory. And I found a very weird disconnect between writing this paper and living in Tanzania. And we were not living in the sort of Western compound. We were living in what's called a Mafrika neighborhood. And I found it really disturbing for me to write a paper like this that I knew people in Paris or London or New York or Montreal would enjoy, but that had nothing to say or to do in terms of impacting or affecting the lives of people who were living in great levels of poverty. Similarly, in terms of my work at the tribunal. So for myself, I thought if I'm going to be doing work, I need it to be intellectually rigorous and engaging and exciting, but I need to find a way for it to make a difference to the things that I care about. And that's that's why I say I feel bad sometimes thinking about this, because I also worry about arguments that, university research must be useful or must, I value the humanities and all of that. So, but for myself, for my own sort of, why get up in the morning, it's because I do things that are intellectually engaging and interesting for me, but also because I'm trying to have an impact on things that I care about. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but I just sort of like, and even the topics that I've ended up working on over many years have almost always been connected to things that I was, that I found out about. Like my PhD was something, I wrote my proposal on the floor of the climate negotiations in Copenhagen. And I was like, this is a really interesting problem and no one's thought about it and I want to solve it or help solve it, and so that's what motivates me. And this disability related climate work is the same thing. And there's so many other things that I'm constantly, I've also ended up now working with colleagues on disability and pandemic related research. And again, it was the same thing. I was just thinking like, okay, who's thinking about this? Okay, no one's thinking about this. We better put a team together and try to come up with something and work with people in the community. And that's the last thing I want to say is I really find it very engaging to speak to and collaborate with people outside of the university setting. That's not that I don't like my colleagues or I also enjoy working with university researchers, but it's something that, and I guess especially for disability, it's such a diverse community. I am also, I'm very aware of my privilege as a white male, socioeconomically advantaged. And so I don't think that my experiences are in any way generalizable. They're just sort of the catalyst for my curiosity and my interest. And also I'm new to this movement. And that's really, the most interesting thing to me has been the willingness of so many people in the movement. When Yolanda and I started contacting people and say, and so these are disabled people's organizations and activists all over the world, and we started contacting them. Hey, we're starting this program. Do you want to join? Do you want to get involved? And the response has been very positive and overwhelmingly so. And I was really surprised coming from the climate movement where things are very competitive and everyone's fighting over scarce resources and over agendas. And I guess I was really surprised that everyone was like, yes, of course, we should do this. We'll work with you. And that's very enriching. And so to be able to work with people who have knowledge of different types of impacts, different forms of oppression and how those intersect is really meaningful. And then being able to work with them. And hopefully next year, and this is what Yolanda will be working on specifically, is strategically trying to move the agenda forward in policy discussions globally. And that's very exciting.
Thank you. And I just want to, if you would like to, as a teacher, so even if you don't want to be, you are a mentor and a teacher, and you are in the classroom. Is there something things you pay particular attention to as a teacher, not just as a subject area expert, but just as a teacher and a mentor?
Mm-hmm. I think that for me, realizing So one of the biggest changes I've made to my teaching since I've started is really bringing in a disability inclusive perspective. And I think that this, in the sort of usual way that we say that, disability inclusive solutions can have resonant impacts that have that benefit more than simply students with disabilities, but the whole diverse learners. This is the main thing that I've discovered is sort of, and specifically in the Faculty of Law, the overwhelming majority of disabilities are invisible disabilities. So they're usually anxiety, depression, ADHD. And it turns out that actually, so I've brought in a mindfulness-based approach, or try to in my work, and it's ongoing, but and different things to sort of also, even, we know from different ways of engaging around not, having very long lectures, but having more activity-based, project-based work. All of these things are really important to me. And I've noticed that most of students are really overwhelmingly like it and benefit from it. So that's been really rewarding. Nandini, you're muted.
I am muted because there was a background noise and I didn't want to disturb everyone. Sorry for that. So Yolanda, I want to ask you as well about your, the rich history you have as an individual and as a scholar, and working on the intersection of gender, culture, and disability. How does this influence you as a teacher in the classroom? How does it influence your life, the choices you make?
Well, I think that you can never really change completely from one identity to the other. So sometimes when I am working in advocacy, or even in grant making, or the many jobs that I've had over the years, I always take the teacher with me. And at the same time, when I go to the classroom, of course, there are so many things that I want to share with my students that are not in the books. And and not necessarily personal, but my observation of what's going on in the ground, how things are really moving at the international arena, how at the in-country level, it changes from one context to other exponentially. And I believe that I am not different from one another. I just have like different objectives. And from the gender perspective in particular, I am trying to always incorporate everything that I have learned from the ground. And I am hoping that the new generations will have a different approach to disability as something that just needs to be there in the feminist agenda. And of course, that it is not necessarily related to people with disability, because in my opinion, what deters people from approaching the subject is that they are very scared because they don't know anything. So the change must go even at the lowest levels of, at the earliest levels of education. Since the elementary school, people should start learning about that. No, and that is something that is already missing, but that I hope that the new generations will be able to teach to their children, or that maybe we will have the opportunity to effectively advocate for inclusion at the elementary level. But as a professor, I think that, that we have a tremendous opportunity to contribute to the disability movement. And I have learned a lot from Sébastien, because also he cannot stop being a professor. Sorry, Sébastien. And when you are a professor, you are always a student, because you cannot dissociate from who we are. We love learning, and we love sharing information. And I hope that we will manage to transmit this passion to to everyone involved in this specific subject, and in the complexity of intersectionality.
Can I, sorry, I just want to jump in and say, I also have learned a lot from Yolanda. In fact, I'm so happy to have her basically as a mentor in this project, because you know, it's a new area, and for me in many ways, and especially on the advocacy side, and I'm so fortunate to have her on this journey. So yeah,
We're a good team.
Well, thank you, both of you. And I think I could not possibly ask any question after such a beautiful conclusion, which Yolanda and Sébastien, both you have brought to this conversation. So I'll just take a minute to thank both of you for participating in this dialogue. And I'm equally thankful for those who came to be part of this live recording. And with this, we will end the recording part of this conversation. And we'll have about 30 minutes for a conversation which is not recorded, just question and answers. And I'll be happy to moderate that session. So thank you very much once again to both of you, Yolanda and Sébastien. I'm grateful.